All right, so we'll get started. Thank you very much, Vatish, for joining us. We're going to be really, I think, having a fun hour ahead because I really enjoy these topics of biomechanics aberrations, and you're going to be talking to us about biomechanics today, corneal biomechanics. For those who don't know, Vatish is from Bangalore in India, now called Bengaluru. Huh? The name has changed, which I just kind of found out. And he is on the cornea service and a research associate. And perhaps you can tell us a little bit, Vatish, about what kind of practice you have right now, and then we can kind of go right into it. We're really looking forward to having you join us in Ottawa in hopefully a few weeks' time. But I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say and learning from your presentation today. So please go ahead.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the introduction. And we would start off with the presentation. Can you see the slide?
Yeah.
Yeah. So good morning, everybody. I'm Dr. Vaitishwaran Ganesan Dalgudi, in short, Dr. Vaitish. And we will be discussing today about the evolution of corneal biomechanics and everything that we need to understand about what is there at present and look at future as well. And we will quickly start with a few broad disclaimers, which is how I usually start my talks. And I always prefer them to be more of fun-filled rather than loaded with knowledge that people go back thinking twice why they attend the session. So if you look at this, there are so many equations. This is just inside of a Brio microscopy device, all the wirings and everything, and you would find something similar when you open a Corvus or any other device, and all the equations and the physical relationships between them and how they are developed. So if you look at all this, it's really perplexing. So the first disclaimer that I want to show at this point of time is, if we hope to develop something that is strongly discouraged. And the next part is, it doesn't mean that I'm going to leave you with thoughts that are as tangled as your headphones right now. No. The basic understanding, the basic purpose of these sessions are to give you a clarity regarding the confusion, because there is definitely a confusion in every developing science, and having a clarity amidst the confusion is the ideal endpoint of every discussion or session. And when you have a lot of things that are different, different people use different devices for their own purposes, and this burger is copyrighted and I use it in my presentations. So it basically goes on to, this burger is to explain that these are buy your own burger or make your own burger concepts, where you pick up ideas, you keep picking up ideas that you want to add into your practice, and then keep making your own burger rather than expecting a fully ready-made burger given to you, which is not as tasty as it would be if you make your own. And the next disclaimer is that in this process of evolution, several times people ask us the question, is this the end point, or is this the best? Is this the criteria for with the best sensitivity and specificity? Shall we go ahead with this one index and figure out everything in our practice? No, at these times it is not. It is wise to actually tell them that no is also an answer, and not try to explain them that this is the best. And the basic way we would go ahead with this topic is based on the Johari window model, which basically is going from the known to unknown and then figuring out what we do about the unknowns at the end. Okay, so we will be switching between the presentation and the live demo of Corvus ST, and if there is a little bit of a technical snag of a couple of or a few seconds, then please bear with that. And so let's start with some basics of what corneal biomechanics is, how it evolved, and so on. So basically, corneal biomechanics is a study which, it is not something that originated in the cornea. This field has been there since centuries, and cornea is just an additional implementation or a subsidiary concept where it was actually applied. And basically, you apply a specific level of force in the cornea, and then you study how much it deforms. Which is the same with studying of biomechanics of anything, be it metallurgy or be it any other specialty. And basically what we need to understand is where this thing falls, where this biomechanics falls in our entire understanding. So from a healthy patient to someone with a keratoconus or an unstable, totally unstable, clinically manifest unstable cornea, if you look at, there are multiple stages through which these patients progress. And if you just neglect the images in between, if you just looked at this from the point of healthy, absolutely healthy, to a point of unhealthy, you have several stages of progression, which could be, an initial change in the elastic modulus of the cornea to a biomechanical change and a topographic change. So these things could, overlap to some extent. These are not watertight compartments, and then you would have a manifest, presentation. So the reason why I showed this up is because biomechanics was initially, it came into the picture to have an early diagnosis of keratoconus. Because if you waited for the topographic features and the slit lamp features to manifest, you would probably be, looking at them at a slightly later stage compared to looking at them in the earliest of stages possible. So there are other intervening stages as well between the healthy and the biomechanical KC, which we would come towards the end of the presentation as well. So basic applications came in the field of early detection of keratoconus and an improved prediction of refractive outcomes. So if you ablate a specific cornea, how far it continues to ablate, whether it stops at an earlier stage or it goes on flattening, depends on the biomechanical strength of the cornea and the effect of cross-linking. Does it actually become stiffer? And you have refractive surgery the cornea has undergone, and then you find out you're not really sure because topography and tomography and your BAD-D and these indices are not really sensitive as far as post-refractive surgery indication is concerned. So in these situations as well, find out that the biomechanics is actually dropped since the time you operated the patient. So these were the initial few applications with which the field started evolving. And if you look at these two broad devices which are available currently are ORA and the Corvus. And literally our presentation would be restricted to Corvus because of the fact that ORA has not been found to be as repeatable as Corvus, though Corvus also has repeatability issues. But most of the recent developments in the field of biomechanics in the last 4 to 5 years has been happening in the area of Corvus ST. So we would stick our discussion to Corvus. And but if you look at both these devices, when they started, they all had an analysis at the two-dimensional level. You apply a force and you study one particular aspect of the cornea, one particular plane of the cornea flattening, and then you assume what is the biomechanics of the cornea. But basically, biomechanics as a material is a three-dimensional phenomenon. And if you looked at what Corvus started giving us initially was, when you apply it a specific, a cornea, you would have, when you apply a specific level of force, what you have is, the deformation of the cornea which happens. And this deformation, if you looked at, basically there are two lines below this red curve. One is a deflection amplitude and the other is the whole eye movement. So what this basically means is, once you apply a pressure on the cornea, an air puff on the cornea, what happens is that the cornea is not the only structure which goes back. The entire globe is also pushed back along with the cornea. So whatever is the amount of deformation, whatever is the amount of indentation that the cornea alone undergoes is your deflection amplitude. Whereas when you combine it with your whole eye movement, so the entire eyeball going behind as well, then you have your deformation amplitude. So these are two broad terms which came in. And since these were found to be slightly better repeatable than your ORA, and these had a better understanding of what your cornea actually meant, the initial understanding was to the extent that if you have a very weak cornea as in a keratoconus, you would have an earlier applanation of the cornea which happens, and there is obviously a greater deformation and there's a delayed recovery. So these were the initial understandings that came up with the Corvus being in use. And with increasing severity, it was also understood logically that the amount of deformation would be higher. But is deformation amplitude sufficient then? Do we have to look at anything beyond, or have we reached a point of end? So if you look at what this figure shows, if you look at the same cornea at two different intraocular pressures or two different pachymetries, you would have two different biomechanical properties of deformation amplitude. So basically you have a cornea with an intraocular pressure inside of say 25 millimeters of mercury, and the same cornea has, after a while, it has an intraocular pressure of 10 millimeters of mercury. Despite the cornea being similar in biomechanical properties, you would have a greater applanation of the cornea happening, or the indentation of the cornea happening when there is a pressure inside is lesser. So people started realizing that just looking at the deformation amplitude was not making sense as a whole, because you have to correlate it with, or factor in out the factor of the intraocular pressure as well as pachymetry. So this was the first understanding that came in with the evolution of biomechanical properties of Corvus. So what did people start doing? If you look at this video, I love martial arts, though I don't practice any. If you look at this, this is called a 1-inch punch of Bruce Lee, and this is a 6-inch punch. And if you look at this video that is following of Ip Man, you see these people are lying flat and he's punching them. if you look at these two scenarios, the basic difference is when you have an object which is holding on to a place without moving. So basically the person is lying flat on the ground, or the person has some resistance to move further. So the amount of indentation that happens on the patient's body is much higher. And when the cornea has freedom of movement, so if you start moving back when somebody starts applying a pressure on you, the amount of indentation or pressure that is applied on your body is much lesser. So that is the whole concept behind deformation amplitude as well. If you look at this again, this amount of movement the person can have behind his original stature is what is contributing to the whole eyeball movement. If the patient, imagine, has a thyrotoxicosis or a frozen globe, where the amount of movement the eyeball can have behind his body is much lesser, then the amount of indentation in the cornea would be higher compared to a high myope in a collagen vascular disease like a Marfan syndrome. In those situations, the amount of space behind the eyeball to move is much larger. So eventually, in spite of applying the same pressure on the cornea, you would still have only a lesser amount of corneal deformation. So these were the two initial concepts that were supposed to be understood as far as interpreting deformation amplitude was concerned. So when we go into the Corvus interface to understand the same, just a second. Am I audible, sir?
Yeah, I can hear you.
So if you look at what your interface of Corvus ST is showing you,
I don't see a screenshot. I don't see your screen though.
Just a second. Yeah, my bad. Can you see one?
Yeah, now we see it.
Yeah. So if you look at what your Corvus ST, the actual interface of your device shows you, this initial dynamic corneal response was what initially Corvus started with. This is called the dynamic corneal response, where you look at deformation amplitude without factoring in the factor of intraocular pressure or the corneal thickness, and without factoring in the actual whole eye movement that happens behind this. So if you looked at, we discussed concepts as in, the applanation happens initially and then there is a maximum concavity that happens. So based on these different mathematical formulae were devised. So basically, if you looked at just the change in the amount of depression that the cornea has from its original position with the dotted red line to the actual final position, which is your deformation amplitude. If you looked at what is the radius of this specific circle that forms in the inner part of the actual concavity. So if your cornea deforms more, you would have a circle of a smaller radius.
Ritesh, we see the right now we see the Corvus screen with the various demos on it. Are you showing a different screen?
Yeah, it's a fixed screen. I'm not.
Okay, got it. Okay.
Yeah. So can you see the cursor? Can you see the white cursor on the screen?
I see the cursor on the Corvus ST menu button.
Corvus. Can you see this cursor moving now?
No.
Okay, so basically, can you see the highest concavity being depicted in the lower half of the cornea and the lower half of the screen share?
No, I just see the first screen where you choose. It says Pentacanthus Corvus ST, has the patient's demographics on the top left, and you can search. It's the initial search screen on the Corvus.
And I'll reshare the screen. Is it seen now?
Yeah, that's better.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is the initial screen which we were speaking about, which is the dynamic corneal response output. So if you look at this was the initial evolution of Corvus, which initially showed you only the deformation amplitude without factoring in the factor of intraocular pressure, because we knew intraocular pressure could significantly alter the actual deformation that happens, and corneal thickness as well. And the whole eye movement is another factor which has to be considered along with the deformation amplitude, because we discussed that aspect too. Because if the cornea has no resistance, the globe has no resistance to move behind, it moves more, and accordingly the amount of indentation on the cornea is lesser. And if there is limited space for the globe to move behind, all the pressure that you apply on the cornea remains on the cornea, and the indentation on the cornea is higher. And if you look at this, another factor which was used again, can you see the cursor now on the highest concavity image?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you look at this image, if a cornea deforms much more, the circle that fits into this concavity is going to have a smaller radius. Whereas if your cornea deforms lesser, the amount of the circle that is going to fit onto the concavity is going to have a larger radius, or basically a larger circle. So as you move towards greater levels of corneal deformation, the circle that is going to have is smaller. So the inverse concave radius, which is the factor that comes out of this, is inversely proportional to the actual corneal strength. And let us look at deformation amplitude from here on as we go further. So when we looked at these other factors, which had to compensate for the intraocular pressure as well. So this is your Vincicura screening report, which is actually compensates for the amount of intraocular pressure of the cornea at that time of indentation. And then accordingly, it gives you a 95% confidence interval within which your cornea is supposed to be normal. And if the amount of deformation that your cornea has, irrespective of even after adjusting for the intraocular pressure, if the deformation is still higher, it means that your cornea is probably weaker. But again, this is deformation amplitude factoring in only the intraocular pressure. We need to factor in the movement of the whole eye as well. So, if this is specifically a normal cornea or a keratogenic cornea, you would have specifically all of them matching together. Just like how in a topography, the area of steepening matches the area of thinning and the area of posterior elevation. The deformation amplitude, if it is higher, your whole eye movement would accordingly be in the normal range in that specific, for that specific patient. And this was the next level of evolution that happened, where you could look at deformation amplitude versus the intraocular pressure is compensated and the whole eye movement as well. But here again, the Corvus device did not give us any specific output combining these two parameters. Then what happened further? If you go back to our presentation here again. Yeah, so we were at this point of time able to handle or incorporate the factor of intraocular pressure and the whole eye movement. But is this all sufficient, or do we need more now? And if you look at this basic single figure, this shows you that these two are two separate corneas. Both of them have the same deformation amplitude. But if you look at the one which is dotted, the one depicted with dotted lines versus the one depicted by continuous line, the one with the dotted line actually starts deforming later, and it starts recovering faster. But still, the deformation amplitude of this cornea as well is similar to the one other cornea which started deforming faster and started recovering later. So does it strike somewhere that deformation amplitude could not itself be an index which can be used to completely assess the overall biomechanical property of the cornea? Yes. So what our group had published initially was using a new index called Kc, which is called a stiffness constant, which actually incorporates all the aspects of the corneal stiffness of the deformation amplitude, including the rise or the rate of rise, the rate of deformation recovery, and the final deformation together into one constant called Kc. But this constant is currently not available or incorporated in the Corvus ST software. And let's go now. So we also have a Kc constant, but though it is not still used, but do we still need more? If you look at this scenario, you would understand that this is a specific clear case of keratoconus, because the area of steepening is matching the area of thinning in the inferior temporal quadrant, and the area of posterior and the anterior elevation also match. So if you look at this figure again, this would at the first glance many people could think that this is an ectasia, but if you look at the actual image, the area of actual steepening of the cornea is not actually correlating to the area of thinning or the area of elevation. So this is basically a post-LASIK decentration, where the ablation has been decentered to the superior half of the cornea and the inferior half is not ablated. So which is why you have an area of flattening which is coinciding with the area of thinning rather than the other way. So here we understand, based on this concept of going from known to unknown, that a single index or a single factor of, say, steepening or thinning or elevation could not in isolation be helpful to come to a final diagnosis, wherein we need and we need more of factors that are multivariate and including more parameters to come to a decision rather than relying only on a single one. The same goes with deformation amplitude as well. So what came up next with the Corvus was, with the Vinciguerra display, was the Corvus biomechanical index, which apart from deformation amplitude and its ratio, combined a few other factors as well to come to one value called CBI, which is the Corvus biomechanical index. And based on testing in a specific population where the author had studied, for a cutoff of 0.5, they had a specific level of sensitivity and specificity. So we have one parameter which is, definitely it's a multivariate index. And the next one which came up was, we saw in the image of known to unknown where we showed pentacam, that pentacam and Corvus are very closely related. So you cannot just look at biomechanics in isolation and not consider topography. So there came the next factor of, your tomographic biomechanical index, where you combine the CBI along with the parameters of BAT-D and the other thickness parameters, tomographic parameters, and you come up with another parameter which is multivariate called tomographic biomechanical index. And again, for the population that was studied, it had a really good sensitivity and specificity and diagnostic ability for a specific level of cutoff for which it was studied. So are we there yet? If CBI and TBI are completely able to relieve us of all the tension and just look at CBI, TBI, and if that is normal, go ahead, and that is abnormal, stop it. We have still not reached the stage. I'll show you that with an example. Because if you look at this, this was a specific patient whom we operated close to 3-4 years back, and for this level of refractive error, she underwent. So this was a topography. Her topography looked absolutely normal. Her indices based on tomographic indices were absolutely normal. And if you look at the other eye as well, there is no asymmetry, and the index of the other eye as well is normal. And we look at this patient again on deformation amplitude, which looked normal, and the CBI and the TBI derived for this patient was again the normal limits. So anybody looking at this stage after understanding how Corvus has evolved until the stage would be slightly definitely be in a position to say yes, go ahead with the surgery. This is what we did as well. And all these indices showed normal. The residual stromal thickness was 310 microns. So this patient underwent SMILE surgery. And after 3 years, if you look at what happened, this was the first visit after the 3 years. And then after another 6 months after the first visit, she had an obvious ectasia just developing. And if you look at this, it was close to 3 to 3.5 diopters of steepening in the central and the paracentral cornea. So this is absolutely not something that we can expect after understanding Corvus to that extent. But so is there anything better? How can we find answers? If CBI and TBI are the final ones, or should we start looking at more? So the answer lies in further abilities as to know which side develops ectasia based on a specific biophysical concept called finite element modeling. And if you look at finite element modeling, what it basically does is, instead of looking at how your Corvus looks at in just one plane, you consider your cornea to be finite elements, and then look at the biomechanical properties of the cornea for each and every element. And then what you do is combine that with your, so this combination concept has been prior before used in aeronautical and other areas of engineering, where you consider a specific car or an aeroplane to have multiple components which all of them differ in their biomechanical properties to finally give you one final biomechanical index. So what is actually being done here is, so this is the work of my mentor, Dr. Abhijit Sinha Roy, where along with Cynthia Roberts and his work, they were able to create a mesh model based on topography with tomography and biomechanical properties combined using MATLAB. And you actually generate the entire cornea as such, and then you apply a specific level of intraocular pressure to it and a specific level of apprenation pressure to it, and study the simulation of the corneal apex displacement. So this concept has not been incorporated as such in the Corvus device, but if you look at this paper that was recently published by the Vinciguerra group, it also utilized a finite element modeling to come up with one index which is called the stress strain index, which is a composite index of the, you could consider that part of the KC index which we came up with in our original, previous paper which I showed you. And this concept of finite element modeling together has come up with a new index called the stress strain index. So this stress strain index, again, if you look at what the device shows you, yes, so here we are. So here this is something called your stress strain index, which is a composite index of your properties of your using your finite element modeling plus your not considering just deformation amplitude as a factor to ascertain, or not just using a CBA or TBI, which are also multivariate indices. So here again, you can go ahead with, here this is to show you how CBI and TBI were actually used. So for CBI, you don't need to actually have a communication with the pentacam, but for your TBI, you need to have a combination of your pentacam values and your Corbett's indices to finally give you one TBI value as well. And this can be used in several scenarios. And if you look at CBI, which is a multivariate index, a recent another publication came up with an idea of calculating the post-refractive surgery normative data of CBI. But for BAD-D and TBI, they are supposed to be used only in corneas that are unoperated or untouched. But if you have a cornea which is post-laser vision correction, you can use the idea of CBI, which also has normative data for corneas which are post-refractive surgery. You can choose the type of refractive surgery which was done, and then go ahead and find out if your patient's CBA falls within the normative range for that particular group. And this is also possible to compare, based on your SSI factor and the other factors that we discussed, your DA ratios and your inverse ratios and SPA ones. So these factors again can be compared pre and post. If you look at another scenario which I can show you, can you see the screen now? Just a second.
I just see the names. You were on the screen before, like the Corbett's was on the screen, but now we just see our names.
Yeah, the Corbett's is coming back. Yeah, okay. I had to shift to another patient. Can you see the screen now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you look at this newer advancements in Corbett's, if you look at these, you can basically load on two separate images or two separate visits of the patient's cornea post cross-linking. Say one is pre-cross-linking, the other is post-cross-linking. You can basically see here that there are two separate corneas that are transposed on each other, and even the stiffness parameters before surgery versus after surgery are compared. And if A is your position, if your A is your situation after surgery, your comparison of SSI as an index as a whole says that your cornea after cross-linking or after any specific procedure has become stiffer. And based on the other parameters as well, you can again study here if based on your DA ratio, again if your DA has gone down, that means your cornea is getting stiffer. And as integrated radius has gone down, your cornea is getting stiffer. And so each of these parameters have been the newer version of the software has provided us the ability to compare head-on how we used to compare in a pentacam in a tomographer before and after a cross-linking or a before and after for a follow-up of keratoconus. So the same thing could be implied, could be used even in a keratoconus scenario, where in the first visit is when the patient was stable, and the second visit when you suspect that the patient is progressing, and then you compare their SSIs between the two visits, and you know that if the cornea has become softer, that means that there is a higher chance that the patient has progressed. And so based on our understandings until now, so I would like to summarize as to what has gone into the evolution until now. So one is the deformation amplitude, which was initially without factoring in the intraocular pressure and the corneal thickness and the whole eye movement. And then came your next Vinciguerra screening reports, where it was factored in against a balanced or a biomechanically adjusted intraocular pressure and whole eye movement, but it did not give you one specific index or value that you could rely on as a combination of these two parameters. And then you came into this other index of CBI, which is multivariate, which was how a normal scientific approach to screening criteria has to progress, which is using multivariate indices, so it's a CBI. And then when in combination with the tomography parameters as well, we came down to TBI. So TBI would take a little bit of time to load, so we would skip that part. And the other recent advancement which I explained to you was, again, with the newer software, you could go into the post laser vision correction mode only for CBI. For several people, when we discuss, they speak to us and they ask us, before surgery the BAD-D was 0.7 and after surgery the BAD-D is 1.8. So does it mean that the patient has ectasia? And they would say that before surgery the TBI was 0.1 and now it is 0.7. Does it mean it is ectasia? No. For BAD-D and TBI, they are not supposed to be used post-operatively. They are supposed to be used only pre-op. And if at all you want to compare based on your biomechanics to see if the patient has had an enhanced weakening of the cornea after the procedure, you could use the post LBC mode and choose the type of surgery that you did, and then find out if the patient falls in the normative range for that specific setting. And the last of this part was comparing, the ability to compare based on the newer indices of SSI, which are a composite index using finite element modeling and your whole deformation amplitude curve as a whole. And based on these, you again had index of SSI, which could be compared. So now we'd go into further advancements. I'm coming out of the screen. Yeah, so let's look at the newer possibilities now. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Yeah. So if you look at the newer possibilities that can be used, now we understood from finite element model that we can create a cornea specific to the cornea that is under study. Instead of looking at the cornea in only one plane, consider the cornea in multiple finite elements and then study the biomechanics. So the same can be simulated after stromal refractive correction. So if you know for a specific platform of ablation, say a wavefront optimized or a topo-guided or a wavefront guided, if you know the amount of ablation in the center, the periphery, and you can simulate it on your wavefront, on your finite element model, what you can study is, before LASIK, you can actually find out what is the actual biomechanics using the Corvus. And using your finite element model, you can actually find out what would be the deformation amplitude after the surgery. So this is called predictive modeling. So this is again not a factor which is currently available in the Corvus device, but this is one of our works published in Journal of Refractive Surgery in 2019. And in combination with, because stromal ablation is not the only thing that happens in a LASIK or a SMILE, because there is an additional flap cut or a cap cut. And when you can also simulate the amount of biomechanical change that happens after a flap cut or a cap cut, and transpose that with the amount of ablation, amount of change and deformation that happens with the stromal ablation or the removal of the lenticule. So if you find these dotted lines, these dotted lines are all simulations. So we had simulated the change in deformation amplitude that would happen at the end of, say, a PRK, at the end of LASIK, at the end of SMILE, for each and every specific cornea under study. And after surgery, after 3 months, when we actually studied the deformation amplitude, they were bang on matching with the actual simulated deformation amplitudes. So if you know that your deformation amplitude for a particular cornea, which is a suspicious cornea, could go further weaker with your procedure, according to the type of procedure and the amount of biomechanical destabilization that is expected, you can accordingly plan a procedure. So here you can specifically see that with PRK, the amount of both the simulated change and simulated degradation of biomechanical strength as well as the attained biomechanical strength is the least. The amount of change is the least with PRK. So that goes with our normal belief, thinking that if there is a patient with a slightly suspicious cornea, it is better to go in with a PRK rather than a LASIK or a SMILE. So this is one thing, but this is not currently available in the Corvus software. But this can be done specifically using your MATLAB imaging, and you can transpose, taking the patient details, feed in the amount of ablation, and then do it. So this is one possibility for the future. And if you look at what this shows, this is another prototype device which is available in our hospital, where you can, the normal Corvus can study the corneal biomechanics only in the center. And invariably you cannot study if the patient has a periostite corneal degeneration or another type of ectasia which is more peripheral than in the center. Your Corvus will not be able to pick. So this is something called a differential Corvus, which is a prototype available in our hospital. So with which what we studied was, if you look at these results, a post-LASIK cornea with a very asymmetric ectasia, if you look at this specific eye, you will be able to find that the inferior deformation amplitude is worse compared to the center and the middle and the center and the superior part of the cornea. Whereas for the eye without ectasia, you would find that all of them are similar. And another example to show the same, a regional biomechanics change was also studied in our hospital between normal eyes, between pellucid corneal degenerations and keratoconus eyes. And if you specifically look at this is the pellucid group, and the one with the red hash is indicative of the inferior corneal biomechanics. And you find that in the PMD patients, your corneal biomechanics deformation amplitude measured in the center of the cornea is looking relatively normal compared to the inferior half of the cornea. So these things would be missed if it's a traditional Corvus which does not measure the inferior half. And again, this is not available in the current Corvus updates. And so are we there yet at the end of all of these, understanding the evolution from scratch until this stage? Are we there yet? I would still say no. Because there are several other factors that can be actually applied further into the device. And one is this, which we discussed, which is the biomechanical outcome, which can be predicted. As you see here, at the end of different predicted different surgeries that are planned, you can find out the amount of degradation of biomechanics that can happen at the end of the surgery. So with the amount of LASIK, SMILE, PRK, and this is not something which is universal. This is dependent on each and every specific cornea, which has to be, you'll have to manually feed them into your MATLAB and find out what happens at the end of the surgery. So this is one thing. And the other one is, this is not the only factor which decides what happens to the patient after surgery, because we are considering an ideal scenario. But if you look at, there are so many other factors which can lead on to a biomechanical degradation, which could be a genetic deficiency in collagen, genetic deficiency in enzymes that cross-link the eye, and enhanced eye rubbing due to allergies, enhanced inflammation in the eye, a hormonal imbalance, and inflammation in the ocular surface, which should all push the patient's eye from a normal level of biomechanical degradation after surgery to an enhanced level, which can actually manifest with post-LASIK ectasia. So if you look at this paper, which was published by a group in JRS in 2019, this shows that the specific patient which I discussed before, where the patient after 3.5 years of the SMILE had come back with post-SMILE ectasia, though the patient had preoperatively normal CBI, TBI, BAT-D, and every other index, and the residual bed thickness was normal. If you looked at the analysis of that patient, what we found out was this patient had a specifically lower level of LOX, which is called a lysyl oxidase cross-linking enzyme in the cornea, and lower level of genetically modified, genetically normally that has to be present in the cornea, which is collagen 1A1, that also had a mutation. So these patients who may have absolutely normal topography biomechanics could have an answer in basic molecular biology or genetics, where because of a deficiency in collagen or a deficiency in the cross-linking enzyme or an enhanced level of MMP9 or other inflammatory factors, these patients could be pushed into ectasia despite your predictive modeling showing that they will not develop. And so we are coming back to this image where we had an initial onset to a later manifestation. So I was initially telling you that I'll come up with something between these healthy and change in elastic modulus groups. So what happens between these is that there are genetic modulations that happen. There could be loss of collagen, there could be loss of a specific enzyme, there could be an knockout mutation, there could be inflammation that happens, and all of these factors would drive the patient's eye from a healthy towards the extreme end of this disease. And we are just looking at biomechanical index and tomographic indices. So if we have to detect ectasia at the most earliest stage, that would be at the level of a genetic or an inflammatory marker in the patient's eye. And if you proceed further, this is one other thing which has a lot of relevance to this area of biomechanics, which is basically called a polarization sensitive OCT. So if you look at this image before, here I told you that these inflammatory changes, these genetic modulations or alterations or mutations, all these things would lead on to a stage where the patient develops biomechanical weakening. But before that, what happens is that there is a change in the order of arrangement of collagen inside the patient's cornea. So this is something which cannot be detected by any OCT or any Scheimpflug imaging, because that requires resolution to the level of 1 to 1.5 microns. So if you are able to find out the stage where the collagen orientation is specifically altered and you can pick up ectasia at that stage, that would be the best thing to have. But we do not have any specific devices available for that now, except this one custom built PSOCT, which was built by our team of imaging specialists in collaboration with Vienna and Italy. And if you look at this based on how a cornea normally polarizes, how cornea transmits polarized versus unpolarized light, we were able to find out, our group was able to find out based on previous publications, that the corneal stroma can get specifically this different stromal orientations can be delineated, or they can be found out based on different polarized lights that are thrown on the cornea. And if you look at this, just showing you one, this is in collaboration with the Medical University of Vienna and based on their publications, and one of our team members had gone on to work with this, who is in the picture below. And this is the custom built PSOCT. You can see that it is not labeled or marketed or covered in any beautiful coverings how a device would normally be marketed, because it's custom built. And if you look at the normal orientation of the cornea, the PSOCT would be able to give you specific retardation maps and specific orientation maps of the axis of the collagen fibrils in the cornea. And this may be really vague to understand the initial part, but if you look at this specific image, if we compared 4 different types of subclinical keratoconus or formless keratoconus, and the one at the bottom is your PSOCT of a normal cornea. And here you find that there is, for a varying level of a suspicious cornea based on your BAT-D, you find that the CBI could either be CBI, TBI could either be in the normal range, or they could be one of them suspect, one of them normal, or both of them normal again. So here, this is an ongoing study. As I mentioned initially, the understanding or the approach to the session is not to give you clarity at the end of it, but give you a clarity amidst the confusion that exists. So what this is to explain is that irrespective of going on with whatever developments that are there in Corvus, even if your CBI, TBI could be normal, but these patients could still have a different level of orientation of the collagen. So only a long-term follow-up of these patients would find us or let us know if whether BAT-D was the sensitive one there, or was it TBI, or was it CBI, or was it a molecular predictor, or was it a ultrastructural marker of the collagen. And just some final lessons to go back to what we already knew. If you look at this image of a cornea on topography pentacam, so most people here in this attending this session or who would view it later would be able to easily find out or point out and tell that this is definitely a suspicious cornea. Some would label it as palm twist or the other ways. But if you look at this patient's actual output of the BAT-D analysis, you would find that the BAT-D is in the normal range, because BAT-D is not an index which considers the inferior superior asymmetry into its 9 parameters which are incorporated in the actual derivation of BAT-D. It incorporates other factors as an elevation and tomographic factors, but doesn't take into consideration the inferior superior asymmetry. But if you look at the same patient on another topographer, which is Schwind, you find that at the end of this patient's screening on Schwind, you find that the device labels it as borderline, that means it is suspicious. So based on inferior superior asymmetry, which is 1.65 diopters, which is mentioned in your SIF value. And so what this basically goes on to say is that you cannot expect to have a clarity amidst the existing confusion, but to be able to understand the various perspectives, because we consider to some extent a pentacam or a BAT-D to be the final a gold standard to what we should consider a patient to be normal or abnormal. And based on that, we compare CBI, TBI, and so many other indices that we study. But if that index itself has a variation with respect to several different presentations of patients, we cannot have 100% clarity as to what we are looking at. So if you look at this initial Johari window model which we started with, there are certain things that we know and everybody knows that it is right, and we just need to utilize it and continue. And there are certain things that we know and the others we do not know and others know, and it's worthwhile to learn. And there are other aspects that we know and others do not know, and it is worthwhile to teach. And there are aspects that either of us know, and what is the best way to go forward is, if the Cirrus device in that topographer was right, or pentacam was right in labeling it normal, or Cirrus was wrong in labeling it abnormal. All these things you would find out only when you have a long-term follow-up and you have a big data, wherein apart from just topography and apart from just tomography and apart from biomechanics alone, a combination of all these factors along with your other factors as in your genetics, molecular, your inflammation, and ultrastructural collagen properties. So we have a long way to go. So basically the final crux of this topic, which I had given the topic as evolution of biomechanics. So I would conclude by saying that this is definitely a revolution, but it is still an evolution. I thank all of you for the wonderful listening, and I would really love your inputs on this.
Well, I don't know what to say. It's like, it's wow, it's amazing. Thanks so much for that. I hope you were breathing throughout your talk, because you were just, your mind was going 100 miles an hour, that's for sure. Thank you so much for that. It's been very informative. I have a few questions, and if people in the audience have a few questions, that'd be great too. The first question has to do with your the biomechanical assessment comparison, and if you have like the ability to see patients in a post-treated state after cross-linking, would you imagine, because I'm looking at we have two big groups of patients who are cross-linked. We have the ones that are in their, basically essentially adult, and then the ones that are in the pediatric age group. The ones in the pediatric age group often need a second treatment of cross-linking, or something is going on. Would this this comparison allow us to determine the pediatric patients that we think may need a retreatment of cross-linking?
Yes, that's definitely an interesting prospect to what the device has at present. So if you looked at the post-cross-linking stiffness parameters, there is no normative data established until now at different time points as to how much the stiffness index increases over time with different mechanisms or different methods of cross-linking, because some people have published using standard cross-linking or the Dresden protocol, some with varying levels of accelerated protocols. And for each of these, there is no specific level of saying this is the normal level of stiffness increase that is expected at say 3 months, 6 months, or 1 year. So if we have at some point of time a normative database for this kind of a population as to how the stiffness increases over time, then definitely yes, the idea that you have in mind as to do the cross-linking and at 3 months for a pediatric patient look at the stiffness index, and if it has not reached the level of a normative level after the cross-linking, then probably the patient may need a cross-linking earlier, or the patient may need other factors to be controlled.
Okay. I had another question as well. I have a lot of questions now, actually.
I would love to.
With respect to, so, when we, with respect to refractive surgery, and when we're thinking of a patient who's in our chair in the office on whether they'll be a good candidate, we've been using, I guess, after your presentation, somewhat crude measures. For example, looking at what the Ks would be afterwards, after a myopic treatment, or looking how much what residual bed thickness would be, or even, some people have argued using the percent tissue ablated would be a good measure. But now with this, the predictive modeling that may be there, you would be able to add to that mix an ability to see what the biomechanical profile would be following, say, a LASIK or a PRK or a SMILE. And I would gather as you would be able to kind of determine by diopter range of treatment. Would that be true?
Absolutely. So the basic concept or the idea behind which this work was done, it was not done by me, I was just a part of it. It was designed and was implemented by Dr. Abhijit Sinha Roy, who is the biomechanics expert. And I have only learned the aspect of the MATLAB utilization of how the software works and how we can feed in a patient's data and analyze and all that aspects. So the idea behind the study was the same, as to be able to feed in a preoperative biomechanics, feed in a preoperative tomography, and then the amount of ablation and the type of ablation based on the device that you're using, and then try and come out with what would be the expected biomechanical degradation after a specific amount of time. But what again I mentioned in the presentation was that there are several other factors, because the wound healing is another factor which is not incorporated in these mathematical models. And the patients with higher level of tear inflammations, higher levels of or lower levels of collagen in the cornea, lower levels of cross-linking enzymes could very well react in a totally different way. And if you looked at those specific set of patients who could actually benefit from predictive modeling, so these are the patients who most of the times have these other factors which have a role, because if they have a normal BAD-D, normal TBI, normal CBI, and normal corneal thicknesses and PTAs, they would most likely not have any other alterations in their corneal healing or in their genetic or molecular factors which could lead them to have such a problem. So with predictive modeling, yes, we are looking at a small percentage of patients who could benefit, but I should be frank in telling you that as these biological parameters are not incorporated in this mathematical model, this definitely requires incorporation of big data into it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then speaking of data, I guess the more normative data we have, the more we can make decisions. Regarding you mentioned that you were able to on the Corvus. Your point is well taken that the BAD and the Pentacam, the current stuff that's on for the BAD is for untreated corneas, correct? But the CBI can be used in a post-LVC state, right? Yes. And so how robust are those post-LASIK, post-SMILE normative data sets to be able to give us this CBI post-LVC?
Yes, so this is again based on a paper of Vinciguerra in 2017 or 18, early 18, where he had studied the normative change in CBI parameters after different refractive surgeries. And so these are all in a specific population, and different populations have different levels of biological response and to the healing process as such. So that is something that we cannot discount in being able to generalize this to the entire population of the world. And even with that, if you are able to find a significant increase in your CBI from 0 to 1, 0 being normal and 1 being the worst, if there is a significant change in your CBI, and in accordance with that, if there is a tomographic or topographic change and a refractive change in the patient, then I would consider it to be a tool to incorporate in the detection of post refractive surgery or post laser vision correction change, rather than just looking at one parameter in itself.
Okay.
But if you looked at just the statistics of that, it would say that it has over an 80% sensitivity or 80-85% diagnostic ability, or 20 out of 18 out of 20 patients who had actual ectasia were predicted based on LVC. So, but these patients who are normal are less in number, but patients are huge in number. But those patients who actually end up with complications and are actually recorded as far as data is concerned, they are not as many in number. So the data, even if it is as robust as for a normative population, those which go into ectasia are still not in such great numbers to be able to tell everybody who is looking at these devices to say yes, this is bang on, or to that extent.
Okay, and then I have two more questions. One question has to do with molecular markers. What role do you think they'll play in addition to our imaging? Is it something that you'll see is going to be kind of standard, or is there still a lot of work to be done because of the diversity of various expressions, phenotypes, all that kind of stuff?
Absolutely. So I'd love to answer that. So basically, applying them in the fields of cross-linking as well as refractive surgery. Most patients, I would not say that should be the norm for testing everybody with using these molecular markers, because at this point in time, they are all lab-based. You cannot do them at the outpatient clinic, because you would have to either take their tears or their corneal epithelium during a PRK or a smile lenticule during a smile, and then process it in the lab with, it requires a dedicated molecular team to do that. But our hospital at present, Dr. Arka Subra Ghosh, who is the lead PhD molecular scientist in this, has recently applied for a patent for a molecular diagnostic kit, which is just like a glucometer, wherein you drop in a drop of blood and it tells you your blood sugars. So you drop in a drop of your tears, and then it will be able to tell you your LOX levels and your collagen levels and a few other inflammatory marker levels. So when it comes to that stage where it is absolutely tested, so that would have an ability for us to, in especially suspicious corneas, which do not have a specific inclination towards either normal or abnormal, looking at whatever devices we have, Pentacam, Corvus, and everything. In those patients, if you are able to find out if these patients are having a higher level of non-specific or a higher level of non-protective inflammatory markers or non-protective genetic changes, then you might as well wait and before operating them or looking at them or watching them for a while. And if you look at the study, the recent patent of Dr. Bala Ambati from Salt Lake City, where he has come up with a new eye drop called Ivina, wherein that is basically a copper-based eye drop which actually enhances the cross-linking of the LOX enzyme, which is basically a copper-dependent ice-LOX base. So those drops are available at this point in time, though not commercially in India, but it could come up in the next few years. And if you are able to find out that your patient has a lower level of LOX, either before or after surgery, before the patient actually manifests with a weaker cornea or an ectasia, you could supplement them with these drops if you are able to actually find out that their LOX levels or collagen levels are lower. And with respect to their response to either refractive surgery or cross-linking, they have published papers in the past where we have shown that the amount of LOX that is present in the tears and in the corneal epithelium before cross-linking determines the amount of flattering that the patient has. So basically, if the patient has a pretty high level of LOX before cross-linking, then the response to the cross-linking in terms of flattening and the amount of stability after cross-linking and the amount of refractive change are going to be much higher. The patient has had a higher level of cross-linking enzyme, which is an innate enzyme, rather than patients who had low LOX. So, and even in refractive surgery, if you looked at the inflammatory markers specifically, everybody knows that those patients who had a higher tear inflammation before any refractive surgery do not perform as well because they have a delayed epithelial healing, or they have a delayed corneal regeneration, nerve regeneration. They have delayed response to recovery of the dry eye on the surface. So all these parameters could be your TM molecular kit could give you specific parameters and say, yes, this patient has higher level of interleukin 1A, this patient has higher level of MMP9. MMP9 is available as a kit, but the other inflammatory modulators are not yet available. And so these factors preoperatively, if you test, and if you're able to treat them with the course of cyclosporin or a low dose steroid for a month or two, and then take them up for surgery, you'd probably have a better response to those patients. They would not complain much of a dry eye or an irritation on the ocular surface, and a lot of other factors as well.
Okay. One last kind of fun question from me. If you had unlimited resources. So the bank account was big, and you had your space, and you had your trained professionals and techs to help you with testing. What would you have in your dream Ectasia clinic?
My dream Ectasia clinic would have the highest level of RAM a computer can support, with the highest level of processing speeds, so that I can use an AI software, I can use a MATLAB, and I can use all the latest Python softwares which can be incorporated and have as much data that I could collect. I need not have all the devices myself. I could have the devices in multiple places and just collaborate and collect data. And if my computer has the capacity to process the data, then that would be all that I would require in an Ectasia clinic. And but yes, if I have to be the surgeon operating and I need to have a topographer, I would still consider having only a topographer at this point of time. At a later date, yes, I would be able to incorporate Corvus and the other aberrometers as well, unless I work in another place which provides me all these. And I would still start with only a pentacam, because looking at a topography gives me a complete understanding of the biomechanics as well as the aberrations of the patient. And it gives me an overall, the maximum impression of what that patient could be going through, rather than having 10 devices at this point, which all of them are not as validated as they are supposed to be. And have an additional large ASS laptop which can support all these data.
Nice. And how about for epithelial mapping? Would that factor into your selection?
You mean epithelial mapping?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. That's something that's an area of work that I love. So, basically what happens with all these devices, the Scheimpflug topographers, they do not have the ability to incorporate an OCT or a Swift source OCT in any form to be able to delineate between the epithelium and the stroma. And all that you can see in those patients are just the curvatures at the level of the front surface of the epithelium rather than what is actually there at the Bowman's. So these are areas where we have done studies on Bowman's topography, wherein using the same MATLAB, you feed in the OptoView or the epithelial images from the ASOCT, the corneal cross sections from the ASOCT, and you will be able to delineate, find out the Bowman's topography without actually virtually de-epithelializing the corneal surface. So this was one of my works where I had compared the epithelial versus the Bowman's topography in a set of patients, and we are still a lot of data is yet to be collected on that. But epithelial mapping is certainly one thing which I would love to have, but I can do that on my MATLAB, on my computer, just with an ASOCT, rather than depend on another Swift source OCT incorporated with a Scheimpflug or a Placido to be able to do that.
Okay. Well, that's great. We're up at 8 o'clock here in Ottawa time. And if there's no further questions from the audience, are we good?
There is one chat comment.
This is from Javier saying, great presentation. Thank you. So not a question, but more like a comment on your presentation, which has been excellent. So thank you so much for your time, Batish. I'm sure this is going to be questions going to be brewing in my mind, and I'll maybe poke your brain to kind of get a bit more insight. But thanks for your time. I appreciate it. It's been very enlightening, and we hope to see you very soon.
I really loved interacting with all of you, and the questions that you asked were those questions that were actually supposed to be those that determine what is the future of these areas. So really happy to be able to answer them and give all of you an overall overview of what this field holds for the future.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Have a great evening. And all right, take care. Thank you again.
Bye-bye. See you all.
Bye-bye.